At 9:15 in the morning on May 26, 1972, a four-engine Navy patrol plane lifted off from Naval Air Station Moffett Field in the southern San Francisco Bay, banked southwest, and flew into a clear California morning. The weather at departure has not been identified in surviving public records. The crew had every reason to expect they would be back on the ground by early afternoon. They never came back. The aircraft, a Lockheed P-3A Orion, Bureau number 152155, assigned to Patrol Squadron 31, was conducting a routine anti-submarine warfare training flight over the Pacific. There were 8 men aboard. The last radio contact anyone ever received from them was a simple routine transmission just 15 minutes after departure, confirming all was well. After that, nothing. No distress call, no debris, no wreckage, no bodies. More than 50 years later, the P-3A and the 8 men inside it have never been found. Let me explain something before we go further. When I first began researching this story, I assumed it would be a straightforward case. A military aircraft disappears near a heavily patrolled section of the California coast, and the Navy can't find it? Surely the record would show something. A mechanical failure, a structural theory, a field of wreckage recovered and quietly classified. But, oddly, there was nothing. No confirmed cause, no wreckage, no official conclusion. It remains one of the least explained peacetime losses of a U.S. Navy patrol craft. To understand why, you first need to understand what the P-3 Orion was and what it was doing that morning. In 1972, the Cold War was not an abstraction. Soviet submarines were a constant operational reality, nuclear-armed, increasingly quiet, and capable of sitting undetected off the American coast. The United States Navy's answer to this threat was the P-3 Orion, a long-range maritime patrol aircraft originally derived from the Lockheed Electra airliner. It carried sonobuoys, magnetic anomaly detection equipment, and torpedoes. It could loiter at low altitude for hours, hunting submarines over vast stretches of open ocean. It was the Navy's primary sub-hunter, and training crews to fly it was a serious, constant business. VP-31, based at Naval Air Station Moffett Field, existed specifically to train replacement aircrew and maintenance personnel for all Pacific Fleet patrol squadrons. The squadron's aircraft averaged 8,600 flying hours a year in training missions alone. Bureau 152155 was flying one of those missions, a standard anti-submarine warfare training flight over the Navy's established operating area off the Big Sur coastline. Public records explicitly identify only some on board by name. Lieutenant Thomas E. Brunk, the plane commander and instructor pilot. Lieutenant J.G. Richard A. Nelson, student pilot. Lieutenant J.G. Joseph T. Becker, student pilot. ADJ-1 Ronald C. Hamlin, flight engineer. AMS-2 William S. Lasco, instructor flight engineer. Plus an additional working crew member and 2 others, including a Reserve Air Force major riding along to observe operations. The aircraft departed at 9:15 in the morning. It was due back around 2 p.m. As the Orion tracked southwest toward the Big Sur operating area, the pilot, Lieutenant Brunk, radioed the Oakland Air Traffic Control Center shortly after takeoff that all was well. That was the last transmission. When the aircraft failed to return and no further contact was made, search and rescue procedures were initiated. There had been no indication of an emergency, no distress call, no radar indication of trouble, no eyewitness report, simply the disappearance. What followed was an extensive search of the Pacific coast. Coast Guard, Navy, and Air Force planes and Coast Guard cutters made a formal search of the area. Heavy fog and bad weather hampered the search during the early phases. Search operations by Navy, Army, Air Force, and Civil Air Patrol aircraft continued for 7 days, but no trace of the missing aircraft was found. The search covered miles of ocean and coastline. No confirmed debris or floating wreckage was discovered. Here is where the story becomes genuinely difficult to explain. The P-3A Orion is not a small aircraft. It has a wingspan of 100 feet, weighs over 60,000 pounds fully loaded, and is filled with equipment. When an aircraft of this size impacts on the ocean, it often, but not always, leaves floating debris. Currents carry wreckage to shore, and yet, in 7 days of intensive searching by 4 separate branches of the military, covering a large area of California coastline and open Pacific, nothing was found. It seems the aircraft was lost while en route to or within its assigned operating area, a corridor that includes Monterey Bay, and here is what makes that geographically extraordinary. The Monterey Submarine Canyon is the largest submarine canyon along the west coast of North America, with steep canyon walls measuring a full mile in height from bottom to top, rivaling the depth of the Grand Canyon itself. It trends southwestward and westward down to an axial depth of 9,600 feet, nearly 3,000 meters of cold, dark water within a few miles of shore. If the Orion came down over or near Monterey Bay, it could have slipped into depths that, in 1972, were essentially unreachable by any search technology that existed. But the canyon alone doesn't fully explain the silence. Even in deep water, surface debris will float. So, either the aircraft went down so abruptly and completely that almost nothing reached the surface, or the early fog and weather dispersed whatever might have floated before it could be found, or, and this is the part the Navy never resolved, something happened that we still don't understand. These are all reasonable hypotheses, but without proof, are only speculative possibilities. What caused the loss? Historians and aviation researchers have proposed several possibilities, but none were confirmed. Catastrophic structural failure might be expected to scatter debris over a wide area. A controlled ditching might have left survivors or floating material. A collision with terrain, the mountains behind Big Sur rise sharply and quickly from the coast, would likely have left physical evidence, none of which was reported from searches of those ridgelines. Engine failure is standard to consider, but a P-3A had 4 engines and was designed to fly on 2. A single failure would not normally be expected to bring down a P-3. Even a double failure would ordinarily have left time to transmit a distress call. There was no distress call. The Navy's own classification of the cause as undetermined is not evasion. It reflects a genuine absence of evidence on which any conclusion could be based. In the years since the incident, Moffett officials periodically sent out investigators when suspicious debris washed up along the coast. Each time, the debris turned out to be unrelated. The ocean returned nothing from Buno 152-155. The families of the 8 men had to accept the unanswered questions. Janet Brunk Ehlers, widow of Lieutenant Thomas Brunk, placed her husband's memorial stone at Arlington National Cemetery, where it sits without the certainty of a known resting place beneath it. She is quoted as saying of evidence of the crash, "It's got to turn up someday." A former Moffett field officer who lived through the search said years later, "I wouldn't be surprised if something turns up. It's got to turn up someday." But 52 years have now passed, and nothing has turned up. This is the part of the story that gets overlooked in the broader history of military aviation. The disappearance of Buno 152-155 was not a combat loss. It was not a famous incident. It happened on a routine Friday morning training flight, in peacetime, within sight of one of the most populated coastlines in America. And still, the aircraft and the 8 men aboard simply ceased to exist somewhere between Naval Air Station Moffett Field and the waters off Big Sur, leaving behind a routine radio call and nothing more. The Monterey Canyon sits in the dark below those waters, 3 kilometers deep in places. Although the canyon itself was well known, much of its deep floor had not yet been mapped in detail, so it could easily conceal wreckage beyond the reach of 1972 recovery technology. More than 5 decades later, no confirmed trace of Buno 152-155 has ever been found, and the Navy's own records list the cause of loss as simply undetermined.